Jake wasn't expecting much from this shift. It was just another regular day working security at the Glenbrook Mall, where the only excitement usually came from the occasional lost child or someone sneaking snacks from the food court. His uniform was a little too tight around the shoulders, and the walkie-talkie on his belt was more of a nuisance than a tool. He had been on duty for hours, half-heartedly walking the perimeter, glancing over security footage on the screen, and trying to stay awake. It was a Tuesday, around 3 p.m., when things took a turn. The crowd was typical, teenagers hanging out, parents shopping with kids, and a few elderly folks taking their time browsing. Jake was just about to take a sip of his half-empty coffee cup when he saw him. At first, Jake thought he was seeing things. There was a man, tall, casually dressed in jeans, a hoodie, and dark sunglasses, standing near the main entrance. His demeanor was cool, almost too cool. No one was really paying him any attention, but there was something off about him. Jake couldn't put his finger on it, but the guy seemed out of place. Maybe it was his calmness in the midst of the chaotic mall, or maybe it was the way he moved, like he had some kind of quiet confidence that demanded attention. Jake decided to walk over, just to make sure everything was fine. It wasn't unusual to have someone wander into the mall, but every now and then, a person's presence stood out for no good reason. "Excuse me, sir," Jake said, his voice a little more stern than he intended. The man looked up, meeting his eyes with an expression that was both relaxed and unreadable. "You can't just stand around here. Can I help you with something?" The man didn't flinch or even seem surprised. Instead, he smiled slightly, taking a step back. "I'm fine, just browsing," the man said softly. Jake raised an eyebrow. "I'm going to need to ask you to move along. The mall's policy is pretty clear. You can't just hang out here without doing anything. If you're not shopping or visiting a store, you'll have to leave." The man paused for a moment. His gaze softened, and Jake could have sworn he saw a flicker of recognition. But before he could say anything else, the man nodded and said, "All right, no problem," before turning and walking towards the exit. Jake watched him leave, still unsure what had just happened. Was it just his imagination, or had that guy looked really familiar? No, he couldn't be. It was probably just another celebrity look-alike. But as he turned back toward the security station, his radio crackled with static. "Jake, did you just ask Keanu Reeves to leave the mall?" Jake froze. "Wait, what?" The voice on the radio sounded surprised, almost disbelieving. "Yeah, the guy you just asked to leave. Keanu Reeves. The actor. He owns this mall." Jake's stomach dropped. His heart skipped a beat, and he felt his face heat up. It couldn't be. Could it? His mind was racing. He'd just kicked out one of the most famous actors in the world. And he hadn't even recognized him. "Are you serious?" Jake muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The radio crackled again. "Yup. He's the owner. And I think he's gonna want to have a word with you." Jake stood there for a moment, the world feeling like it was spinning a little too fast. He glanced over at the exit doors, where Keanu had just walked out, his silhouette disappearing into the parking lot. This couldn't be happening. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake's heart was still racing as he stared at the exit, unsure if he should run after Keanu or just disappear into the walls of the security office. He had only been working as a mall security guard for about 6 months, and while he had seen his share of minor incidents, he had never expected something like this to happen. He had always been the kind of guy who played by the rules, doing his job with what he thought was the right balance of authority and kindness. But now, he felt like the biggest idiot in the entire mall. A few minutes later, the door to the security office swung open, and his manager, Sandra, stepped in with a serious look on her face. She was always calm, cool, and collected, and when she looked at him now, her expression didn't change. "Jake," she started, her tone measured but carrying a certain weight. "We need to talk." Jake opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He wasn't sure if he should apologize right away or just keep his mouth shut and wait for the inevitable lecture. Sandra pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. "I just got a call from the boss." Jake swallowed hard, the realization of what was coming hitting him like a ton of bricks. The boss. The owner of the mall. "Look, Sandra. I didn't know," Jake stammered, his voice a little too high-pitched. "The guy, he didn't seem like anyone special. Just some guy loitering, and I was just doing my job, you know? No harm meant." Sandra didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at him with something like pity, but also, strangely, understanding. "It's not about doing your job, Jake," she said gently. "It's about knowing who you're doing it for." Jake blinked. "Wait, you mean, he's the actual owner?" Sandra nodded. "Yes, and I think you've just made a very serious mistake." The air felt thick with awkward tension. Jake was desperately trying to figure out how to fix this, but nothing was coming to mind. His palms were starting to sweat. Is he mad? What do I do now?" Sandra sighed and ran a hand through her hair. "Honestly? I don't know. He's always been pretty chill about things. He could have made a big deal out of it, but he didn't. Instead, he's just asked to speak with you." Jake froze. "What?" Sandra leaned forward. "Look, I'm not here to scold you. You're new to this, and we all make mistakes. But Keanu Reeves is one of the most down-to-earth people I know, and if anyone can turn this around, it's him. But it's on you to make things right." Jake felt the weight of her words sink in. The more he thought about it, the worse the situation seemed. He had no idea how he was going to face Keanu Reeves, let alone apologize. What did he even say to someone like that? I don't know what to do," Jake admitted, his voice strained. "I really screwed up. What if he hates me?" Sandra gave him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sure he doesn't hate you. But you'll have to go down there and face him sooner or later. Just don't do what you did earlier, don't panic, okay? Be honest. He'll respect that." Jake took a deep breath. "All right. I'll go and try to fix this. But Sandra, what if he wants me fired?" Sandra stood up. "That's not for me to say. But you'll handle it, Jake. I believe you can." As Jake walked out of the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had gone horribly wrong. The hum of the mall's air conditioning and the faint chatter of shoppers did nothing to ease his nerves. All he could think about was how, in one moment, he had gone from being a completely invisible, low-level mall employee to being in the presence of one of the most famous men on the planet. The irony didn't escape him. Keanu Reeves, cool, humble, and an absolute legend, and here he was, the guy who had kicked him out. Jake made his way toward the mall's management office, every step feeling heavier than the last. As he got closer, he could see the faint outline of a figure standing near the doors, waiting. His heart skipped again. And then, as if fate were playing a cruel joke, the man he had thrown out was standing there, Keanu Reeves himself. Keanu was dressed casually in a jacket and jeans, but even without the sunglasses, Jake recognized him instantly this time. He looked relaxed. His face was calm, but there was something else there too, a quiet amusement behind his eyes. For a moment, Jake thought about just turning around and walking away. It felt like the right thing to do. But no, he had to face this. "I'm a grown man," Jake thought. "I can do this." "Hey. Mr. Reeves, Jake started, his voice betraying him slightly. Just wanted to say I'm really sorry for earlier. I didn't recognize you, and yeah, I probably shouldn't have kicked you out. Keanu smiled faintly. It's all right. I'm used to being overlooked. His voice was even, kind, and Jake could hear no sign of anger. In fact, there was something almost gentle about the way he spoke. I didn't mean any disrespect, Jake said quickly, I was just doing my job, you know? It's my first year here, and I was just following the rules. Keanu nodded. I get it. Security has to do their job, no matter who's around. But sometimes, you don't get to choose who walks through those doors, do you? Jake blinked, unsure of how to respond. But Keanu didn't give him a chance to answer. Look, Jake, Keanu continued, I'm not mad. But I do think you might have learned something today. He stepped closer, his tone shifting ever so slightly. Next time you make a decision like that, remember, not everyone who seems out of place is a threat. Sometimes they're just, well, a little different. And that's okay. Jake swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if Keanu was being kind or if this was some form of quiet, passive-aggressive payback. Either way, he couldn't tell if the situation was over or just getting started. But one thing was clear, he wasn't getting off easy. Jake stood there, trying to wrap his head around what Keanu was saying. The words seemed to float in the air, but they didn't quite land. Not everyone who seems out of place is a threat. It sounded simple, almost like something his grandmother might have said. But hearing it from Keanu Reeves, the actor he'd grown up watching, gave it a weight he couldn't ignore. Keanu gave Jake a small, reassuring nod before turning to walk toward the mall's back exit. I'm gonna head out for the day, Keanu said, glancing over his shoulder. But I'll be back around tomorrow. We can talk more if you want. It's not every day I get kicked out of my own mall. Jake's eyes widened, but before he could say anything, Keanu was already gone, leaving Jake standing in the hallway, processing everything that had just happened. The words, we can talk more, echoed in his mind, but Jake wasn't sure if that was a good thing. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next. Was Keanu really going to have another conversation with him? Did this mean his job was on the line? Was he being fired in the quietest, most awkward way possible? His mind spun in circles as he walked back to the security office, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every step. The next day felt like it would never end. Jake showed up for his shift, half expecting someone to pull him aside and tell him his time at the mall was up. Sandra, his manager, didn't seem like she was avoiding him, but the silent tension in the air was enough to make Jake's stomach turn. By the time his lunch break came around, Jake was a bundle of nerves. He had barely eaten, his appetite lost to the looming uncertainty of what was to come. He couldn't stop thinking about Keanu, about how calm and collected he had been when Jake expected anger or frustration. I didn't know what to expect from him, Jake muttered to himself, walking past the food court. He tried to ignore the fact that everyone around him seemed to be whispering about the incident. After all, it wasn't every day that a mall security guard accidentally kicks out a Hollywood legend. His thoughts were interrupted when his phone buzzed in his pocket. The text was simple, but it hit Jake like a freight train. Keanu wants to meet with you again. Noon. His office. Don't be late. Jake froze in his tracks. His palms were suddenly clammy, and he felt his heart rate spike. The message came from Sandra. She hadn't given him any other details, and that just made things worse. Why did Keanu want to meet again? What could he possibly want from Jake? At noon, Jake found himself outside a door he never imagined he would be standing in front of. The sign above it simply read, Mr. Keanu Reeves, mall owner. He took a deep breath. He could do this. He had to. This was a chance to fix his mistake, to make things right, to learn something. The door swung open before he even had a chance to knock. Standing there was Keanu, looking just as relaxed and unbothered as before. This time, Jake didn't hesitate. He stepped inside and stood in front of Keanu's desk. Keanu gestured for Jake to sit, and Jake did so, trying to mask the nervousness that was beginning to creep up again. "Jake, good to see you again," Keanu said, his voice warm and kind, but there was a definite seriousness in his tone. "I thought we could talk about what happened yesterday, and maybe, I don't know, share a bit of insight into what it's like running this place. If you're up for it." Jake nodded, feeling a mix of confusion and relief. "Yeah, thank you. I don't know what to say. I feel like a total idiot for what happened. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Keanu raised a hand, stopping him before he could spiral into another round of self-pity. "Jake, you didn't cause trouble. You just made a mistake. It happens. But that's why I wanted to talk to you." Jake looked up at him, trying to read his expression. Was he serious? Was he actually trying to help him? Keanu leaned back in his chair and started to speak slowly, carefully. "You know, I've been in the public eye for a long time. And, over the years, I've learned that people are quick to judge others based on appearances. You see someone acting out of place, and you assume the worst. But, really, that's not the best way to approach life, is it?" Jake thought about it for a moment. His knee-jerk reaction to Keanu had been based on his own assumptions. He had seen a man standing there, doing nothing, and made a snap judgment. "I guess not," Jake said quietly, a little sheepish. Keanu smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made Jake feel bad. Instead, it was more like a smile that said, "You're learning, and that's all that matters." "Sometimes," Keanu continued, "we miss the opportunity to really see people for who they are because we're so focused on how they look or how they're acting in a given moment. You got the wrong idea about me, but that's okay. What matters is what you do with that moment of realization." Jake was starting to get it. Keanu wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He was teaching him. This wasn't about making Jake feel bad for his mistake, this was about giving him the tools to grow from it. Jake straightened up in his chair. "I understand. I'll try to do better. Not just at my job, but, well, in life." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. "I think you will. You've got a good heart, Jake. You just need to trust it more. And when it comes to people, try to see them for more than what meets the eye." Jake smiled, feeling lighter. It wasn't the typical, boss gives advice, kind of conversation. This felt more like a mentor guiding someone on the path to becoming a better version of themselves. "You've got this," Keanu added with a soft chuckle, getting up from his chair. "And don't worry about yesterday. Everyone makes mistakes, but it's how you handle them that counts." Jake stood up, grateful for the opportunity, for Keanu's patience, and for the chance to make things right. Maybe it wasn't such a bad day after all. He left the office with a sense of hope, ready to face whatever came next. Jake's shift continued that day in a strange, new way. He wasn't exactly walking on air, but there was something lighter about his step. Keanu had spoken to him as though he had real potential, not just as a security guard, but as a person. And for the first time since starting his job at the mall, Jake felt a flicker of something else, respect. Not just from Keanu, but from himself. Maybe he wasn't the screw-up he had thought he was. As he continued his patrol through the mall, Jake took note of the way people interacted with him. The usual customers, mothers pushing strollers, teenagers chatting on their phones, elderly couples browsing through sale racks, seemed to move around him without a second thought. But now, every time someone looked at him, he saw the world through a slightly different lens. He wasn't invisible. Not anymore. When he passed by the food court, Jake spotted Sandra sitting at a table with a coffee cup, watching him approach. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but curiosity. "Jake," she called out as he drew closer. "How did it go?" Jake stopped, a small grin forming on his lips. "It went better than I expected. He actually gave me some advice. Not just about the job, but life in general. It was kind of humbling." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "Humbling, huh? I thought he was just gonna chew you out. I can't believe you actually got the chance to talk with him. That's huge." Jake's grin deepened. "Yeah, well, it turns out Keanu's a lot cooler than I thought. More down to earth, you know." Sandra chuckled, leaning back in her chair. "He's Keanu Reeves. Of course, he's down to earth. But you're right, he's not like the way some people think he is. I'm glad you got to see that." For a moment, they just stood there, the noise of the food court around them blending into the background as Jake processed what Keanu had said. "It's how you handle mistakes that counts," the words were still ringing in his mind. Later that evening, as Jake made his rounds through the mall for the final time that shift, something strange happened. He noticed that Keanu was back, this time, not as a celebrity or a boss, but as a man. He was walking through the mall alone, a bag of clothes tucked under his arm, his hands in his pockets as he moved quietly among the shoppers. Jake was struck by how normal he looked in the midst of the everyday chaos. For a split second, Jake considered walking up to him, maybe striking up another conversation, asking if he needed anything. But he quickly realized, he wasn't just some guy with a uniform anymore. He was a person. So, instead of going over to Keanu, Jake gave him a small nod of acknowledgement from a distance. And Keanu, ever observant, gave him a brief but knowing nod in return. It was like a silent agreement between them. Jake didn't need to do anything more than just be who he was. The rest of the evening went by without incident. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt calm. He wasn't dreading the next moment. He wasn't anticipating another screw-up. He was present, living in the now. The next few days passed in a blur. Jake continued his work at the mall, but everything had subtly shifted. People, whether they were customers or employees, seemed to treat him differently. He started noticing their small gestures, how they smiled when they saw him, how they spoke with a little more respect in their voices. It wasn't that Jake had suddenly become some kind of mall hero, he wasn't. But somehow, the way he carried himself had changed. The confidence he had always lacked, the feeling that he belonged, had begun to grow inside him. Then came the weekend, a busy Saturday afternoon in the mall. It was chaotic, just like always. Jake was standing near the escalators, watching people as they moved up and down. His radio buzzed. "Jake, you there?" It was Sandra's voice. He took a deep breath and clicked the button to respond. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" "Keanu just showed up," she said, her voice suddenly quieter. "He wants to meet with you again. He said it's important." Jake's stomach did a little flip. Again? He wasn't sure if he was ready for another conversation, especially with everything that had happened in the last few days. But there was no turning back. It was the opportunity he'd been given, and now he needed to show that he had learned. As he walked toward the back offices, Jake's mind raced. What could Keanu possibly want now? Had he noticed the shift in how Jake was carrying himself? Was this just another life lesson he was about to receive? When he entered the small office, Keanu was standing by the window, looking out over the bustling mall below. "Hey, Jake," Keanu said, without turning around. "I've been watching you. You're doing better. I can see it. The way you walk. The way you carry yourself." Jake hesitated. "You've been watching me?" Keanu turned slowly, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "I've been around. You'd be surprised how often I blend in." People don't recognize me when I'm just, well, a guy in a hoodie and jeans. Jake chuckled nervously. I guess you're right. I didn't exactly recognize you the first time. Keanu nodded, his smile widening. And that's the thing, Jake. You're learning how to see. You're noticing the details. You're not just going through the motions. You've got potential. Jake swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. I didn't realize it until now. But I get what you mean. It's about being present, right? Keanu's eyes softened, and for a moment, it was like the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. Exactly. It's about living in the moment and knowing that every step you take is part of your journey. You can't always predict what happens next, but you can control how you handle it. Jake took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. This conversation, like the others, was exactly what he needed. Thanks, Keanu, Jake said, his voice steady now. I think I'm finally starting to understand. Keanu gave him one last, knowing look before turning back toward the window. You're on the right path, Jake. Keep walking it. With that, Jake turned and left the office, the feeling of purpose lingering in his chest. The mall wasn't just a place he worked anymore. It had become a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that sometimes, it's the unexpected encounters, the small moments of change, that truly shape who we are. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt ready for whatever came next. Jake's confidence continued to grow with each passing day. What Keanu had said to him kept echoing in his mind. It wasn't just about doing his job, it was about being present, about seeing people for who they were, not just what they appeared to be. Jake started applying that same approach to his interactions with others, whether it was his fellow security officers, the store employees, or the mall's visitors. It wasn't long before things began to change around him. One evening, during a particularly busy stretch, Jake noticed something different. A situation that might have been handled with his usual routine, a quick confrontation, a stern warning, and a few glances at the clock, now felt different. It was a typical Friday night. The mall was packed with people browsing for last-minute gifts. Families rushed past, kids pulling at their parents' sleeves, teenagers hanging out in groups, laughing and goofing off. Jake was stationed near the food court, scanning the crowd as he always did. But tonight, something caught his eye. A teenage girl was standing off to the side, looking lost. Her eyes darted around frantically, her hands shaking. She was dressed in a hoodie, and though it didn't seem like she was causing any trouble, Jake could see the distress in her posture. He'd seen it before, a lost child, or in this case, a teenager who'd wandered too far from her parents. But something about this girl's expression felt urgent. She wasn't just lost, she looked terrified. Jake approached her slowly, trying not to startle her. Hey there, are you okay? He asked gently, putting a little distance between them to make her feel less cornered. The girl jumped, but when she saw Jake, her eyes softened, and the tension in her shoulders relaxed. I think I've lost my mom, she stammered, her voice trembling. She's just gone. I've looked everywhere. Jake nodded, his experience kicking in. All right, no need to panic. Let's get you some help. We'll find her. Without hesitation, Jake led the girl to a quieter part of the mall, his eyes scanning for any sign of her mother. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but this time, it didn't feel like a chore. It felt like the right thing to do. His heart was in it. And it wasn't just because it was his job, it was because he cared. The girl followed him silently, still shaken. They reached the mall's security office, where Jake immediately contacted Sandra to help. There's a young girl here, lost from her mom. We need to start a search right now. Sandra's voice was sharp on the other end. I'm on it, Jake. Don't worry. A few minutes later, the girl's mother rushed into the office, her face red from panic. Jake could see the immediate relief wash over her when she saw her daughter standing there. The girl ran to her mother, throwing her arms around her. "Thank you," the mother said to Jake, her voice quivering. "I was so scared." Jake smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "No problem. It's what we're here for." As the mother and daughter left the office, Sandra looked at Jake with a raised eyebrow. "Well, you handled that one pretty well." Jake shrugged, his usual humility kicking in. "Just doing my job. Nothing special." Sandra didn't respond immediately, but her gaze softened, and for a brief moment, she looked at him like she was seeing him in a new light. "You know, Keanu was right about you." Jake's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Keanu. "What do you mean?" "You've been different lately," Sandra said, leaning back in her chair. "More calm, more aware of what's going on. I've been watching you. You've been taking things seriously, but in a more thoughtful way. It's good to see you like this." Jake felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He wasn't expecting a compliment, but it felt good to hear it. Especially coming from Sandra, who was always the first to point out when things went wrong. The following week, Keanu showed up again. This time, however, he wasn't just walking through the mall like any other regular customer. He was with someone, a man in a suit, who Jake didn't recognize. They were standing in front of one of the new stores that had opened recently, discussing something in low tones. Jake hesitated, unsure if Keanu would even notice him this time. But then, Keanu turned and caught his eye, flashing him a smile that seemed to say, "I see you." Keanu walked over, the man in the suit trailing behind him. "Jake," Keanu greeted, nodding in acknowledgement. "Good to see you again. This is Alex, a business partner of mine. We're just discussing some upcoming changes at the mall. Thought I'd swing by and say hello." Jake stood a little straighter, the words of their last conversation coming back to him. See people for who they are. He'd learned not to judge on appearances, but now he felt it more than ever. Keanu wasn't just a movie star. He was a business owner, a mentor, and in some ways, a reminder of what it meant to be human. No matter the fame or fortune, people were just people. "Hey, Keanu," Jake said, a confident smile tugging at his lips. "It's good to see you again. How's everything going with the mall?" Keanu smiled, his eyes lighting up with genuine warmth. "It's going well. Things are looking up, thanks to people like you who take pride in what they do. We're adding a few new features around here soon, just some improvements to make the experience better for everyone." Jake felt a sense of pride. Keanu wasn't just talking about business. He was talking about community, and Jake was a part of it now. "Sounds great," Jake said, genuinely excited about the changes. "Looking forward to seeing the improvements." Keanu nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You should be. We're in this together. Just like everything else. It's the little things that make all the difference." For the first time, Jake truly understood what Keanu meant. It wasn't just about the big picture, it was about the small moments. The lost girl. The quiet conversations. The way everything in the world fit together, piece by piece. As Keanu and Alex continued their conversation, Jake felt an unexpected sense of peace. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about being the right kind of person. The kind of person who didn't need to be perfect, just real. He walked away with a new sense of purpose, like the pieces of his life were finally starting to fall into place. And as for Keanu? Well, it seemed the lessons weren't over yet. Jake's life at the mall had transformed. With each shift, he felt more confident, more aware of the world around him. The mundane aspects of his job that used to make him feel invisible now felt like opportunities for growth. He wasn't just keeping the peace anymore, he was connecting with people, making a difference, no matter how small. But, as Jake would soon learn, change is never linear. Sometimes, life throws you a curveball when you least expect it. And that's exactly what happened one Wednesday evening. It was another hectic night at the mall. The holiday season was in full swing, and the food court was packed with families grabbing dinner, teenagers hanging out, and the sound of chatter bouncing off the walls. Jake was stationed at the entrance to the food court, keeping an eye on things, when a loud argument broke out near the fountain. At first, Jake thought it was just another disagreement between two teenagers, the kind he had dealt with countless times. But as he approached, he could see that the situation was escalating. Two men were shouting at each other, red-faced, pointing fingers and getting dangerously close to shoving. "Hey, hey!" Jake called out, trying to intervene before things got out of hand. "Knock it off, guys." But the men didn't listen. They were too worked up, too caught in the heat of the moment to pay attention to him. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered guy, shoved the other in the chest. The impact sent the smaller man stumbling back into a display stand, knocking over a few items. The crowd around them began to murmur, some people backing away, others pulling out their phones to record the incident. Jake didn't hesitate this time. He moved toward the men with purpose, his training kicking in. "You need to stop right now," he said firmly, stepping between them. "I'm going to have to ask you both to leave if this keeps up." The larger man, now red-faced and breathing heavily, turned his attention to Jake, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" he growled, pushing past Jake's shoulder as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. Jake held his ground, the adrenaline starting to spike in his veins. "I'm the guy who makes sure everyone stays safe around here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want to be escorted out, trust me. But I will do it if you don't settle down." For a moment, it seemed like the man might back off. But then, out of nowhere, the smaller man lunged forward, shoving the bigger guy right in the chest, pushing him into the fountain. Water splashed everywhere as the larger man staggered, falling backwards into the shallow basin. The crowd gasped, some laughing, others cheering, and a few calling for security. Jake's heart raced. This was no longer just a disagreement, it was turning into something far more dangerous. If he didn't act fast, things could spiral out of control. He quickly radioed for backup. "Sandra, I need help at the food court. We've got a situation here, things are getting physical." Sandra's voice came through the radio almost immediately. "On my way. Stay safe, Jake." Jake stepped forward, trying to separate the men before anyone got seriously hurt. "That's enough," he said, his voice rising in authority. "You're both going to have to leave the mall, or I'll have no choice but to call the cops." The larger man, drenched and furious, pushed Jake aside, knocking him off balance for a moment. The smaller guy, now emboldened by the chaos, was shouting insults, clearly not in the mood to listen. Just as Jake was about to take action, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A familiar face in the crowd, Keanu. He had walked into the food court with a small group of people, likely there for a meeting. But instead of continuing with his group, Keanu was watching the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. Jake felt his stomach twist. Of all the times for this to happen, why now? His first instinct was to rush in and get the situation under control, but something in Keanu's gaze stopped him. There was a subtle nod, a brief but intense look of understanding. Keanu didn't need to say anything, Jake knew what he had to do. This was a test, not just of his skills, but of his growth. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped forward, his posture shifting from that of a security guard to someone with authority. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to push. "Listen to me," Jake said, his voice low but steady. "This ends now. You've both made your point, but this is a public space. You're not going to ruin it for everyone else. I need both of you to step back and calm down." The larger man, still seething with anger, looked at Jake as if he were daring him to make the next move. But something in Jake's eyes, maybe it was the quiet confidence, or the way he stood his ground, seemed to make the guy pause. He looked at the smaller man, who was still hurling insults, and then back at Jake. After a long beat, the tension in the air seemed to break. The large man took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine. Whatever. I'm out of here." The smaller man, still muttering angrily, seemed to follow suit. He glared at Jake as if he was the one who had ruined his night, but he turned and stormed off without another word. Jake exhaled in relief, the adrenaline from the confrontation still buzzing in his body. As the crowd started to disperse, he noticed Keanu walking toward him. "Well, that was something," Keanu said, his tone casual but with a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure how you'd handle that. But you did well." Jake couldn't help but smile, feeling a sense of pride rise up in him. "Thanks. It wasn't easy, but I knew what I had to do." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You did more than just stop a fight. You kept your composure. You found a way to keep control without escalating things. That's what it's all about, right? Handling things the right way." Jake couldn't believe it. Keanu, the man he had accidentally kicked out of the mall just weeks ago, was standing here, complimenting him. "I guess I'm learning," Jake said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I used to think I was just a guy in a uniform. But now I feel like I'm part of something bigger. Like I matter." Keanu's smile softened. "You do matter. You always have. And don't forget, Jake, it's the way you treat others, the way you handle challenges, that makes you who you are." As Keanu turned and walked back toward his group, Jake stood there for a moment, the words sinking in. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was more than just a security guard. He was a part of the mall, a part of something that was constantly changing, constantly evolving. And in that moment, Jake knew, this was just the beginning of his journey. The test wasn't over yet, but he was ready for whatever came next. Jake felt on top of the world. His confidence had never been higher, and the mall had started to feel like his second home. He was handling situations with a calmness that surprised even him, and he found himself naturally connecting with the people around him, customers, employees, even other security officers. But the test he had passed earlier that week was only the beginning. Jake didn't know it yet, but the world around him was about to shift again, and this time, it would be more than just a routine challenge. It all started when Jake was assigned to a late shift. The mall had just closed, but there were still a few people finishing up at the food court and others lingering in the parking lot, getting ready to leave. As Jake made his rounds, his walkie-talkie crackled with a voice he hadn't expected. "Jake, are you near the west exit?" Sandra's voice came through clearly, though there was an edge of urgency in her tone. "I'm on my way." "What's going on?" Jake replied, feeling the shift in his stomach. "There's a problem," Sandra said, her voice tight. "It's Keanu." Jake froze. Keanu? What could possibly be wrong with Keanu? The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. Keanu had been nothing but kind to him, offering him advice and encouraging him to grow. The idea that something could be wrong with him was unthinkable. "I'm heading over now," Jake said, his steps quickening. "Is he okay?" "Not exactly," Sandra replied. He's in the office." "And Jake, he's not alone." Jake's heart rate picked up. "What do you mean, not alone?" Sandra paused, as if debating whether or not to continue. "He's with someone who, well, let's just say, things don't look good. You need to get here fast." Jake didn't waste another second. He sprinted toward the security office, his mind racing. What could possibly be going on? What did Sandra mean by not alone? Was Keanu in some kind of trouble? He thought back to their recent conversations, to the calm and encouraging man he had come to know over the past few weeks. This didn't make sense. When Jake arrived at the security office, Sandra was standing outside, her arms crossed, looking visibly shaken. The door was cracked open, and through the small gap, Jake could hear muffled voices. One of them was Keanu's. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door, his eyes scanning the room for answers. Keanu was sitting on one of the chairs, looking disheveled, his face drawn with concern. Across from him sat a man, dark hair, sharp features, dressed in an expensive suit. Jake recognized the man immediately. He was someone Keanu had been seen with before, but this time, the situation felt different. Tense. Dangerous. The man looked up as Jake entered, his cold eyes narrowing. "I think you should leave, security guard," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We're having a private conversation here." Jake's instincts kicked in, but he stayed calm, walking into the room without breaking eye contact. "I'm afraid I can't do that. Keanu's my responsibility." "What's going on here?" The man stood up, his posture rigid and threatening. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he sneered, taking a step toward Jake. "You've been playing around in a world you don't belong in. I'm the one who owns this mall, and I think it's time you learned your place." Jake's heart skipped a beat. Owns the mall? The realization hit him hard. This man wasn't just some random associate, he was the real owner of the mall, the one Keanu had never mentioned before. The very person behind the scenes, pulling the strings of everything that had been happening. Before Jake could respond, Keanu stood up, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something darker. He stepped between Jake and the man, his eyes fixed on the stranger with an intensity that Jake had never seen before. "Stop," Keanu said, his voice low, almost warning. "I didn't want you involved in this." Jake's confusion deepened. "Keanu, what's going on? Who is this guy?" Keanu turned slowly to Jake, his expression a mix of regret and determination. "Jake, this is Peter Corbin. He's the real owner of the mall." Peter scoffed. "Not just the mall. The entire property development project. Keanu here is just a face, a public figure. Nothing more." Jake's mind was racing. He had always assumed Keanu was the one in charge. He had always seen him as a figure who had taken responsibility for everything, who had the vision for the mall's future. But now, Keanu's words shattered that illusion. Peter looked back at Jake, sneering. "Keanu might be a nice guy, but he doesn't run anything. I do. And I think it's time you understood the truth. Keanu's presence here? It was all a stunt. A way to make the mall look better to the public. He doesn't actually have control over anything." The revelation hit Jake like a slap to the face. Keanu, the man he had looked up to, the one who had shown him how to handle conflict with calmness and strength, had been a puppet in someone else's game. Keanu's gaze softened as he met Jake's eyes, but there was something else in his expression, a vulnerability Jake had never seen before. "It's true," Keanu admitted. "I don't own this mall. But I've been trying to make it better for the people who work here. For the people like you, Jake." Jake swallowed hard. The confusion swirling in his mind now mixed with a feeling he couldn't quite place. He was angry, but he also understood Keanu's position. It wasn't his fault that he had been playing a part in a much larger scheme. Keanu was still the man who had helped him see his potential, who had taught him that being true to yourself was the most important thing. Peter's voice broke through his thoughts. "You'll learn your place soon enough, Jake. The reality of this mall, of everything here, isn't what you think it is." Keanu stepped forward again, his voice steady. "I'm still trying to make a difference, Peter. No matter what you say, I'm not just a face. I'm here to do good for the people who make this place work." Peter snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Your good intentions won't matter in the end, Keanu. You're out of your depth." The tension in the room was thick, and Jake could feel the weight of the truth sinking in. Keanu wasn't the owner. He was a figurehead. And yet, there was something more in Keanu's words, the way he had stood up for Jake, for what was right. That was the real strength, not ownership or power. "Keanu," Jake said, his voice steady, "I don't care about who owns the mall. What matters is that you're here, making a difference." Keanu's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, Jake saw a flicker of the old man he had met all those weeks ago, the one who had believed in him before anyone else did. "You're right," Keanu said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "And I'm not going anywhere." For Jake, this moment, this unexpected truth, had changed everything. The journey was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear, Keanu had become more than just a mentor. He had become someone Jake could rely on, someone who had shown him the true meaning of integrity, even in the face of the hardest truths. Jake wasn't just a security guard anymore. He was part of a bigger story, one that was still unfolding. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that everything he thought he knew about the mall, and about Keanu, had just been turned upside down. The moment the truth about Peter Corbin being the real owner of the mall had settled in, Jake felt a mixture of confusion, betrayal, and a fierce need to understand what was really going on. Keanu had tried to explain, but the words didn't quite ease the knot in Jake's stomach. Keanu wasn't a mere figurehead, he was trying to make the mall a better place, even if the power to truly shape it was beyond his grasp. But the revelation of Peter's role, and the sinister undertones in his words, made Jake realize how little he actually knew about the forces at play behind the mall's glossy facade. For the next few days, Jake couldn't stop thinking about that night in the office. He continued his usual shifts, greeting customers with the same level of care he had grown into, but his mind kept drifting back to Keanu. The public face of the mall was still the same, warm, inviting, and professional. But Jake knew now that behind the scenes, things were a lot more complicated than he had ever imagined. That Thursday evening, after another hectic shift, Jake found himself in the break room, staring at his phone. He had avoided talking to Keanu for a few days, unsure of how to approach him. But as he scrolled through his messages, one text stood out. Keanu had left him a simple message: "We need to talk." Jake hadn't realized how much he needed that conversation until he read those words. He felt an urgency to meet Keanu, to hear his side of things, and to figure out how he fit into all of this. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the back exit of the mall, where Keanu had suggested they meet. The parking lot was nearly empty, with just a few cars scattered around. Jake spotted Keanu leaning against his car, the dim light from the overhead lamps casting shadows over his face. As Jake approached, Keanu pushed off the car and gave him a slight smile, though his eyes were tired. "Hey," Jake said, his voice tentative. "You wanted to talk?" Keanu nodded, motioning for Jake to sit in the passenger seat. "Yeah. There's a lot you don't know. But I think it's time you hear it." As they sat in the car, Jake could feel the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Keanu turned to him, his expression serious. "Jake, you've got to understand that everything I've been doing here, it's not just about appearances. I've been fighting a battle you don't see. A battle with Peter, with the way he's running this mall, with the way he sees the people who work here. It's a power play, and I've been trying to stop it from getting worse." Jake frowned, his mind racing. "What do you mean? I thought you were working together." Keanu's lips pressed into a thin line. "I thought so too, at first. But it's never been about working together for him. It's always been about control. Peter wants this place to be a profit machine, without caring for the people who actually make it run. The workers, the customers, the security guards, you're all just numbers to him." Jake's heart dropped. He had always prided himself on doing his job with integrity, on making sure the people who came to the mall were safe and treated with respect. The thought that someone like Peter was only interested in profits made his stomach churn. But why keep up the act, Keanu? Why let everyone think you were the one in charge? Keanu's eyes darkened. Because I had to. If I made it clear who Peter really was, it would have been a disaster. I needed to keep things calm, keep people believing in something better. I couldn't risk everyone finding out the truth and freaking out. Jake leaned back in the seat, taking in what Keanu had said. It made sense in a way. Keanu had always been trying to build a better atmosphere, even if it meant taking a back seat to Peter's ruthless ambitions. The realization made Jake see the situation from a new perspective. Keanu wasn't just a mentor. He was a person caught in a larger struggle, someone who was working from the inside to make a change, even if it was impossible to see on the surface. "What's your plan now?" Jake asked, the weight of the situation settling in his chest. "Do you think you can stop him?" Keanu exhaled slowly, rubbing his eyes as if the burden of it all had finally caught up with him. "I'm not sure. I've tried to take small steps, keeping the mall's atmosphere as positive as possible, making sure the staff feels valued. But Peter's got control of the budget, of the major decisions. It's hard to fight him when he's got all the leverage." Jake stared out the window, the distant hum of the city outside a stark contrast to the quiet tension in the car. He could see Keanu's struggle now. It wasn't just about fighting for his own position. It was about fighting for the soul of the mall, for the people who worked there, and for a vision that had nothing to do with profit margins. "I don't want to be just a pawn in his game," Jake said finally, his voice stronger than he'd expected. "I'm with you, Keanu. If there's a way to make a difference, I'm in." Keanu's eyes flicked to him, a glimmer of gratitude flashing in his gaze. "I appreciate that, Jake. I really do. But this isn't an easy fight. It's going to take more than just us. It's going to take everyone who believes that the people here are worth something more than just numbers." Jake nodded slowly. "Then we start with what we can control, right? We start by showing people they matter." Keanu's smile was small but sincere. "Exactly. It's going to be tough, but if we can get enough people behind us, maybe, just maybe, we can turn this around." As Jake stepped out of the car, a newfound sense of purpose settled over him. Keanu wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Jake had a place in the battle, and he was ready to do whatever it took to protect the people who made the mall a community, not just a business. But as he walked back to his post, a voice inside him whispered, this fight was only beginning, and things were about to get a lot more complicated. The unseen battle for the mall's soul had just started, and Jake was ready to stand with Keanu, no matter where it led. The following days were a blur of quiet strategy. Keanu and Jake kept their heads down, doing their best to maintain the peaceful atmosphere of the mall while subtly rallying those who might be willing to stand with them. But the truth hung in the air like an electric charge, crackling with potential but ready to explode at any moment. Jake had never imagined that he'd be part of something like this, a covert operation inside the very mall where he worked. But after hearing Keanu's story and seeing the disdain Peter had for the people who actually made the place run, Jake was more determined than ever to help Keanu bring about real change. The stakes had never been higher. It was a Friday evening when everything came to a head. The mall was bustling, as usual, with people shopping and hanging out, oblivious to the brewing storm behind the scenes. Jake kept his eyes peeled as he made his rounds, trying to gauge who might be on their side. He saw Sandra talking to a group of employees by the food court, whispering urgently with a few of them. Her eyes met Jake's for a brief moment, and he could tell that the time for subtlety was over. They were ready to move. Keanu had arranged a meeting with some of the other key players within the mall, a few trusted managers, longtime employees, and security staff who had already started voicing their concerns about Peter's management style. It was now or never. They had to take a stand, or Peter would keep tightening his grip. Jake checked his watch. It was almost time. He headed to the security office, where Keanu was already waiting. Keanu looked more serious than Jake had ever seen him, his usual calm demeanor replaced by the weight of the battle ahead. "You ready for this?" Keanu asked, his voice low, but filled with conviction. Jake nodded. "We're doing this together, right? We've got people who want change." Keanu gave a small smile. "Yeah, we do. And I think it's time we make it official." They didn't waste any more time. Keanu led Jake to the back of the mall, where they had arranged for the employees to meet. Sandra was already there, along with a handful of others, all wearing expressions of quiet determination. They stood in a circle, whispering among themselves, ready to support whatever move Keanu and Jake had in mind. "We've all been working here for years," Sandra said, her voice steady but with a fire underneath it. "And we've seen what Peter's really about. He doesn't care about us. He doesn't care about the people who make this place what it is. He's only interested in squeezing every last cent out of it." There were murmurs of agreement from the group, their frustration palpable. But Keanu held up a hand, silencing them. "Look, I know this hasn't been easy," Keanu began, his voice clear and strong. "I've been trying to keep things calm, but we can't keep pretending that everything's fine. Peter is making decisions that hurt this place. He's making decisions that hurt us. And if we don't stand up now, we'll all lose something that's much more important than money. We'll lose the heart of what this mall was supposed to be." Jake watched as the group's resolve strengthened. It was clear that Keanu's words had struck a chord with them. They weren't just employees, they were people who cared about each other, about the customers, about the community that had built around the mall. They weren't just going to let Peter take that away. "It's time we take this to Peter," Keanu continued. "We need to make him understand that we won't stand by and watch him destroy everything we've built here." Jake stepped forward, his voice confident, though his heart pounded in his chest. "We're ready to fight for this place. For what it stands for." There was a collective nod, and the group moved quickly to put their plan into action. Sandra and a few others would meet with Peter first, confronting him in a way that would make it clear they were no longer afraid. The rest of them would remain in the background, ready to act if things escalated. The confrontation would take place in Peter's office, a place that had always been off-limits to the employees. It was where the power resided, where decisions were made without regard for the people affected by them. Jake and Keanu knew that if they could break down that barrier, they might have a chance to change everything. As they walked through the back hallways of the mall, the tension was palpable. This wasn't just another day at work. This was a turning point. The clash between Keanu's vision and Peter's greed was about to come to a head, and there was no turning back. They reached the door to Peter's office, where Sandra and the others were already waiting. Keanu knocked twice, and the door opened. Peter was standing behind his desk, his face cold and unreadable. "I see you've decided to pay me a visit," Peter said, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "How nice of you. I wasn't expecting a group meeting." Keanu stepped forward, his posture strong. "Peter, it's time we had a real conversation. You've been running this place like a business for far too long, without thinking about the people who work here. The people who make this mall run. It's not just your playground for profits." Peter's lips curled into a sneer. "You've always been good at pretending to care, Keanu. But the truth is, you've never had the guts to run this place the way it needs to be run. You're weak. You can't see the bigger picture." Keanu's voice remained steady, but there was a fire in his eyes. "The bigger picture is that people matter. We're done being your pawns." Sandra stepped in, her voice rising with conviction. "This place isn't just about numbers, Peter. It's about the community. It's about the people who spend their lives here. And we're not going to let you tear it apart anymore." Peter's face darkened, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. You think you can just come in here and change things? You're all replaceable. Every last one of you. I don't need any of you. But Keanu didn't flinch. You'll see soon enough that you can't do this without us. You won't just replace people like you think. We've got the support of everyone here. The staff. The customers. And we won't let you ruin everything we've worked for. For a moment, there was silence in the room, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then Peter spoke, his voice quieter but still laced with venom. You think you've won, but this isn't over. I'll make sure of it. Keanu didn't back down. It's already over, Peter. You just don't know it yet. As they turned and walked out of the office, Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They had made their stand. The fight wasn't over, but it had begun, and for the first time, he felt like they actually had a chance. The mall, the people, the community, they weren't just objects in Peter's game. They were living, breathing entities that deserved to be treated with respect. And Jake, along with Keanu and the others, was ready to fight to protect that. They had won the first battle. Now, they would finish the war.